Welcome, Hannah Forsyth, to the Burning Archive podcast.
Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Hannah, you have just recently written a book called Virtue Capitalist, which is a history of professions and management. And you also wrote a history of the university in Australia, which will be of interest to many listeners of the podcast, viewers of the YouTube channel. This is really intriguing stuff because, I mean, managers and professions, we sort of see them in the television all the time. We sort of have certain images of them, but what's the real story behind it? And I guess that's probably what your book goes into to some degree. And I guess many listeners will also have a bit of their own experience of the university today, which they might relate to as well. But I guess just to kick off, you describe yourself as a historian of work, education and capitalism, I think I read on your bio. What's your overall kind of perspective on sort of history and your sort of professional sort of outlook?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking such a good question. It's I finished my book on universities. I was interested in the question of why universities had become so important to 20th century capitalism. And there were lots of reasons that I'd been able to talk about in that book, things like the importance of innovation to 20th century kind of post-industrial economies and things. But what struck me as being really important was how it was the growth of the professions. So when we look at the change in the composition of occupations in Australia from 100 years ago, we're dominated by agriculture and with a very large manual working class, to the rise of professions is really an extraordinary story that I felt hadn't really been told properly. I'd always been interested in capitalism as a cultural phenomenon. And I had grown a new interest in the way it functions in economic ways as well. And so I wanted to draw together. So what we're talking about is I was already a historian of education. Work, if I was going to do work, this is labour history, and the other one was economic history. And I really wanted to combine those in a way to think about history from a different angle than any of them did by themselves, and with the cultural history training that that was kind of standard fare for the time that I went through the University of Sydney a little while back.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, you may not know, but I did my PhD in history, in the history of work, and my PhD was about the history of the building industry in Victoria, so like the 8-hour day and all that kind of thing. And I don't know, it's a bit of a similar kind of perspective change sort of thing, because, people tend not to think about the building industry terribly much. It's the working class. Well, these days, I guess they're the perfect image of the working class, but the classic sort of labour histories were more the industrial working class and, peasants and all that sort of thing. And in a way, you're telling the story of a different occupational group, a very big occupational group, the professions. What is that story, or what is the story that you tell in, if I get the name right, Virtue Capitalist: The Rise and Fall of the Professional Class in the Anglophone World, 1870 to 2008?
Yeah. Look, it's true that our typical labour histories focus on the working class, and for really good reasons. That the working class has produced the value for capitalism since the Industrial Revolution, and should act as a model for some of the ways that we can rethink the future, I think. But so in thinking about the professions, I started off really kind of thinking about what sort of people are these? Do they constitute a class? And we've got a literature that says No, they don't even exist as a class. They don't even, or they do, but they're very connected to the working class and things like that. But what I thought there was a different story that needed to be told in the end. Once I had done some research on this, and I started doing the research in Australia, and then realised that the borders of Australia didn't make any sense in this story. I really needed to expand it to the Anglophone world. So I hope that the historians of Canada and New Zealand and things will forgive me for treading on their turf, let alone the United States and Britain. But so what the reason why it was important to bring those in was that the British middle class already had this very strong sense of a moral position. And this moral position, as we know from the Protestant ethic and everything, had already shaped much of the character of Western capitalism. Now, in the Anglo settler colonies, which were kind of developed a different character, partly because of the American Revolution, this moral middle class were pretty much in charge. So that aristocracy was distant, or there were only a few of them. And there was a growing sense that the things that middle class cared about should be how these new nations would run themselves. That was politically, but also in terms of the economy and all of the other ways as well. So by the kind of last quarter of the 19th century, that British middle class, with their moral sense of the relationship between merit and work and achievement as being the foundation for a good society and economy, with a hierarchy that would reflect the level of your merit and achievement, those things, that all of a sudden, a very large quantity of money started flowing from the City of London that had kind of, the Industrial Revolution had built up a lot of money and if you think about what you've got to do with money, if you're a bank or if you're a person, even a middle class person, investing that money for a profitable return is what you're after. There was probably, honestly, they were probably better off if they had invested it in Britain, but they didn't. All these colonies were there with all these exciting opportunities of railways and roads and things. So lots and lots of money went from the City of London into all of those settler colonies. Now, with this moral middle class in charge, they were then able to invest both a combination of that money and their ideas in building a kind of civilization that reflected the things that they cared about. And much of this was grounded in human capital. So education and healthcare reflected things that a growing sense that value should be stored in the bodies of people in these colonies. So
can I just ask you there, Hannah, like if you were to talk about like an individual figure who somehow represents that moral middle class in the second half of the 19th century of the Anglophone world, like, I mean, the person who comes to mind to some degree for me is like Florence Nightingale almost. It's sort of like she's, defines the nursing profession. She sort of is heavily involved in all the, kind of social reforms, all that sort of thing. And she's part of that sort of reorganisation of how British society sort of works, well, the British Empire works in the second half of the 19th century to some degree. Would that be a fair symbol, I guess, of this idea?
I mean, Florence Nightingale herself was probably a little more elite than most of the people who were moving into the professions, but she certainly does embody, and I'm glad you mentioned her too, because women were so much more important in all of this than you would think. So the lawyers and the accountants and the engineers were literally building the settler colonies and were transferring all the property and doing all, looking after the accounts and all those things. And they were growing much more rapidly in the settler colonies than in Britain too. But women in nursing and teaching, but also medicine and other things like that, were deliberately bringing their kind of ideas about feminine authority, as Florence Nightingale really encouraged and embodied herself into those sorts of spheres. So, for example, in Sydney, a young woman called Louisa Green was just finishing school, and she came from quite a well-known local family. Her father was a politician, and as she was finishing school, she felt that she needed to do something. And so she and her sisters and her mother turned their house into a school. And so this was a business that these girls would profit from, literally. But they also felt that by working in education, they were investing what they had from their class status into the society in which they were doing. And so women did this a lot. And that means that all the nurses that were not just working in hospitals like we think of them now, many were starting their own home-based businesses in exactly the same way as doctors were working from their own home, or and accountants and lawyers and were working in kind of one-person businesses. Hospitals and schools were often quite similar, and women were starting those in a similar kind of way. Yeah. So I guess that this professional class was kind of trying to build, and this is why they're virtue capitalists. They're investing that virtue for a return that they imagine to be a combination of economic and moral profit for themselves and also for the colonies. And I think what's important about this is to see that the moral and the economic in that process became the same kind of stuff. And that, so that became important later in the 20th
Would you, and this is also happening, would you say, in America as well? So, like, I'm thinking, is it Jane Jacobs, the kind of progressive type figure? She's a similar, this sort of,
Adams, yes.
Jane Addams, yeah. A similar kind of figure. Even potentially you could say Woodrow Wilson is like maybe a slightly later incarnation of the same sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. And John Dewey and, all of those progressives that are bringing their ideas about what society ought to look like, what a professional ought to be like, and they meant but in their character as well as in what they were doing. Are all coming together, and they're talking to one another across the settler colonies and with Britain as well. But it's really growing very quickly in those settler colonies. So the United States is happening at the same time. There's some small differences in the structure of the institutions that emerge, but the class is growing, and in very similar patterns. When I put together the graphs, they looked exactly the same.
So in terms of the sort of story of the rise and fall, you sort of talked about the emergence of the beginning, I guess, of that rise in the second half of the 19th century. So how does the story develop from there?
Yeah, I mean, so I think what's important is to see that American scholars, Barbara and John Ehrenreich, called them the professional managerial class. And what matters about that, I think, is that it was a kind of combination of this interweaving of their morality with their expertise, as if those were the same thing, and with a doing, so a kind of knowing and doing on both sides. And so by the middle of the 20th century, when the whole world has to recover from 2 world wars and a Great Depression, these people see themselves as the moral and economic leaders of the world. And so all of those big institutions from the middle of the 20th century, the International Monetary Fund and the whole Bretton Woods apparatus, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, are all kind of big institutional expressions of the rise of this class. So I think we could probably talk about that middle part of the 20th century as the moment when these guys are in charge of the world. And the world is kind of ordered around the things that they care about. It is important that this came out of a colonial setting. So the professions have always been very hierarchical, and this is part of the sense of your relative merit as you increase in your achievement as you go through your individual career, and the ways that the value of this is kind of measured along those lines. But those hierarchies really mirrored the kinds of hierarchies that the colonists developed as they took over Indigenous lands across both North America and Australasia. And so they were also deeply racist. They were both gendered and gendered on purpose in ways that drew on both male and female types of authority, but also profoundly racist and involved kind of just so when Florence Nightingale was sending out all those nurses, as she did, she literally sent them to set individuals to go and train nurses in the colonies. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
No, that's okay. You were saying
they were actively pushing out working class women from healthcare, right? So the kind of old Dickens, Sari Gamps characters were kind of running around as working class women doing this work, and so the middle class women had to say, we don't want that, and that there's something wrong with that character that's right with our middle class respectability that we should bring into this. And so they did some similar things with race. So, and you think about the ways that medicine at the same time was pushing out the people that they would come to call quacks. That also included Chinese medicine. And as well as, of course, all Indigenous medicine and things like that. So the types of hierarchies that they were produced were very racist. Now, in the middle of the 20th century, right when these people are in charge of the world, we've also got a process of decolonization beginning, where those kind of racial hierarchies that had governed the world up until this point were being actively brought into question by people who were seeking to decolonize their own worlds around them.
So we're talking about 1940s, 1950s at this point, or yeah? So like independence of India, for example, in whenever it was, 47 or 48, I can never remember.
And then, the growth, the entry of people of colour into the United Nations, and things like that began to expose and just show the professional class the order that they had built, and so that the mirror that they had built their hierarchy on was now being mirrored back to them in a way that was slowly beginning to make them see, oh, we might have made some mistakes in this process. And so we think about the ways that the American Civil Rights Movement begins in schools is part of that story of teachers then having to reflect on the ways that everything that they had built into their profession was also deeply racist. And soon we've got Paulo Freire in South America starting to say, this is, if we're going to decolonize, then we have to start with the professions. And so that causes a moral crisis among the professions.
And when you use the term racist, I mean, like, it's a very has lots of emotional connotations, that term, but is another way of putting that is it relates to all the different, I guess, relative power of the different groups and the empires across the world. I mean, so, you see it in Australia with the Indigenous population, see it in India with the local, exploitation of India. You see it in America with, after 1945, the entire world is subjected to America. But so
yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. I guess what I don't mean is that each one of those individuals was racist in their way of feeling about other people. What I mean is that the hierarchical structure that they brought into being, that then ended up shaping the whole global economy, had these racial hierarchies as well as gendered hierarchies built into the system. And hierarchies of class, just as they were pushing out working class women from, as if those working class women had fewer morals and skills, which there's no reason why that should have been the case, but they believed this in a structural way, that the order of society should reflect those kinds of hierarchies.
So the 50s and the 60s, I guess, it's like the high point of this, the professional class. What happens then?
Look, things really start to come to a head in the 1970s. processes are building. So changes like the civil rights movement are building, like the forms of decolonisation that are starting to change, lead to desegregation in schooling in the United States, for instance. But all of those kind of coalesce. And if we think about the fact that they coincide with the massive transformation to the global economy, reminds us that those things were not actually separate. That as the 20th century economy was built, the moral and the economic were the same thing. So as the moral is collapsing and the economy is collapsing, they're collapsing together. And turning into something really radically new. And so every one of the professions has a moral crisis at this point. And it's surprising how far this goes. We can see it in schooling because of the kind of wishing to expose the hidden curriculum, of kind of radically seeking to transform the nature of teaching, the growth of independent schools that are trying to do something really radically different. In nursing, there's also a shift away from the very deep gendering of that work, so that women are saying, we don't want to wear those stupid uniforms, those caps and veils, they're sexist, we want to change. We want a recognition of our skill and professionalism rather than of our womanhood, which the profession had built deliberately on that basis. But by then that no longer made any sense. Social workers began to see this was a real crisis. If we think about the stolen generation in Australia and similar processes in North America and New Zealand, the social workers had to see that they were part of the problems that they were claiming to be solving. And this was a really difficult moment for, and so that some social workers who would actively then seek to reconnect children who'd been taken from families to families found themselves punished in the process, and that's a difficult time. Engineers had to face the fact that they had turned the world into a polluted concrete jungle, and they thought that they had literally built civilization, and now they had to see that perhaps they had done this wrong. Lawyers began to see that they were complicit with many of the structures of inequality in society, and they began to develop things like legal aid, but also critical legal studies, kind of ways of rethinking the law. Medicine was under massive attack from feminists. I think probably they were the harshest dealt with in this particular moment, and had to reflect themselves on many aspects of their behaviour, and had a massive crisis over abortion. But the one that I love the most in some ways is accountancy.
All right. I'm thinking of Monty Python episodes here, but
it's hard to like the fact that even accountancy that were kind of prided themselves on nothing but the straight balance sheet. All this is about is giving the facts. If you think about what it was like to do accountancy under the volatile inflationary conditions of the 1970s, what constitutes profit was so controversial that the British had a royal commission to look into how profit should be calculated. And this had led the accountants to have to admit that this was not objective at all, that they had always been applying particular types of techniques that would make things look in one way or another, that profit was itself a kind of fundamentally subjective category of effort, and that they had to then this is kind of the foundation in some respects, the material foundation of the legitimation crisis of the 1970s. But all this was, none of this really applied, interestingly, to managers or bankers, whose moral crisis was almost the reverse, where the world had seemed so boring and upright and everything like that, that they now sought to be freed from the constraints of the world that they were now emerging from.
And so do you see the 70s as a key moment when sort of, I guess, managers as a kind of a social group come on to the social stage and I guess assert more power over both professions and other groups in society?
Yeah, look, managers are so interesting, such an interesting category of work. They're there in the late 19th, early 20th century, kind of developing with the complex systems like railroad. But they're not really a discrete occupation in any of the censuses, as far as I recall, until the middle part of the 20th century. Then they start to grow quite quickly in the 50s and 60s, settle a little bit in the 70s, but it's the massive growth since the 1980s that is a really striking change to the kind of composition of the professional managerial class. There's some good reasons why they're growing at that time. The globalization is really hitting by the 1980s, so that kind of money is flowing in ways that are much less predictable than they had ever been since the end of the Second World War. And that really demanded much more attention be paid to how that was happening, so in order to manage any sort of enterprise at that time. But they certainly growing by far the fastest occupation growing since the 1980s, with almost no shift in gender composition at all. So most of the professions feminized from the 1970s onwards, with a rapid escalation in the 1990s when I left school and started university myself, as was suddenly the expectation. I was from the country where most women had not done that, but suddenly this was the case, and so that women overtook men in law students by the mid 1990s. Management did not change at all, so stayed mostly male in composition from throughout that period of growth, and also I think profoundly masculine in the way that it thought about itself, the kind of tough decision making, and the ways it was presented. I remember all those 1980s pictures of often kind of slightly overweight but very wealthy man with a young, attractive woman in front of a swimming pool, like that. There was something kind of very sexual about the type of power and it was, of course, we're not talking about all managers, but this was valued and seen to be part of the big entrepreneurial shift of the time.
Well, what is it? The Business Review Weekly is the big, like, is that still around? I can't really remember, but I think it was like, it became like the iconic magazine of, I guess, the entrepreneurial / managerial class. And it really, I think it was founded in the late 70s, early 80s. And then, they started publishing a rich list and all that sort of thing. And it sort of became a big sort of thing in the culture. And I mean, there's an interesting aspect here where this part of the story kind of overlaps with my own professional experience, having worked in the Victorian government for 33 years, from whenever it was, 1990, and so have observed, I guess, the interaction between professions and managers. And also with higher education over the years, but we might get back to that a bit later, because there's maybe some interesting oral history you can do with me as part of that. But so do you see the managers as kind of the nemesis of the professional class? Is that their downfall? Or so if we're at this 70s, 80s now, and the professions have lost their kind of moral sheen, and they're being bossed around, so to speak, by these sort of sharp-toed managers, what's the sort of state of play in the going up to 2008?
Yeah, and up to the present, isn't it? Look, I think that there's a couple of things going on. While the professions are having this moral crisis, they help managers in some ways to dismantle some of the things that had previously bolstered their virtue, right? So just like the nurses are kind of wanting to get rid of the uniforms and the caps and veils and things, many are seeing that this idea that this moral character inheres somehow somehow fundamentally in white middle class bodies, it now seems that a way to undo that would be to see that virtue or those ethics or the standards, which were all the same thing, as something that you could systematize. And so managers wanted to systematize this because that was something that they could then control, but professionals really helped them do that because that seemed like it would be a good way to reverse even some of the hierarchies that they had established in the process during the period of colonization, and that became sexist and classist and all sorts of things as well. So that's how those two things were connected, that professionals helped managers to do that. But for managers, and interestingly for bankers as well, which is my next project is about bankers, so they're on my mind at the moment. The kind of tendency to take each of the professions had particular sets of virtues that were theirs. So you can think about probity for accountants, and for nurses, the kind of hygiene, purity, types of things, courage, duty. And they kind of formed a constellation of morality that they all shared in some way. But for managers, this needed to be abstracted in some way that would help them to do their job regardless of the type of enterprise that they were doing. And so this really became abstracted into something like success. Profitability, but success, really. So a success by itself, just this kind of empty abstract success, became really the only virtue that mattered to the managerial class. And that meant that the morality that had been, admittedly harmful, could now be left up to the market. And so the kind of long-standing ideas from Hayek and the Mont Pelerin Society and things that turned into the type of neoliberalism that we know so well, it kind of became infused in this abstract sense of success as the only virtue that mattered, so that the market would determine what was moral. And so that meant that the relationship between managers and professions had changed. Managers could now be in control of the idea of success as the only virtue that mattered, and that this virtue was now extracted from the individuals, no longer part of our individual character, but meant that they could manage that. And you think about all the ways that this turned into the audit cultures that we in universities know far too well, of kind of risk management, quality management, other ways of managing ethics that helped then for professionals to be kind of plug and play in this, so that and put managers in charge. So that kind of sets us up in workplaces with a kind of manager versus professional who still need virtue to be able to do our jobs, in fact, and where managers have got a kind of much more hard-nosed sense of success as the only thing that matters, then that puts us into a form of conflict. And this is a conflict, I think, that is reflected much more widely in a political sense, and we see it in politics and as well as in workplaces.
Well, that's really fascinating. And I guess one of the things I'd like to tease out a little bit is the sort of I guess professions v managers kind of thing. And I mean, to some degree, I guess it depends a bit upon what your definition of a profession is. Like, I spent 33 years as a public servant. Was that a profession? Was it management? Was it some sort of weird outsider version of both? But I mean, just a couple of anecdotes. And as I was listening to your story, I was just thinking about ways in which some of the conflict that I've observed over the last, 40 years or whatever, has been kind of within the professions themselves. So, I mean, the social work profession, like I worked in the Department of Health/Human Services for a very long time, and there has been a very long-term struggle between social workers and the medical profession, which also plays out within the management of those sort of organisations to some degree. So there's conflict within those professions, and sometimes it's certainly in my direct observation through the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc., there was a kind of moral purpose to some degree, at least in the early years of the management reforms of many of these organisations, which was to, I guess, in their terms, to stop them being controlled and serving the interests of the professions who controlled them, and get them to serve the interests of the customers or clients or citizens who they served. And I, like when I first joined the public service, there was, and this is a bit of oral history for you, but when I first joined the public service, there was a very senior manager who explicitly explained the sort of ethos that was being imparted to us, I guess, as management as a way of wresting control from the professions in order to serve the public better. And you know, some of the history of like the big disability institutions and all that sort of stuff very much does actually reflect that sort of change. So
and there's certainly something there, isn't there? But I mean, medicine is strikingly self-interested throughout much of this history, but so are all of the other professions in many respects. Like, you know, and that's, I guess, one of the things that I've skipped over in talking about them in the way that I have here. But you know, it is also true that as well as instilling those various hierarchies, they are coalescing as a class, and I do think that we can talk about them as a class for themselves throughout much of this period, and that their self-interest guides. It doesn't guide everything, you know, because you can't just talk about any of the professions actually as being wholly self-interested, because almost all of them are there to do something that has a moral good that goes beyond them. But their collective behaviour is nevertheless very frequently more self-interested than it is kind of serving the public. And so, you know, this shift becomes something that you're right, has a moral purpose itself, because they've been, certainly by the time that they're at the height of their power, the professions are able to assert quite a lot of not just authority in society, which is true, so that they're kind of meddling in people's lives a lot, down to telling you how many times a day you should brush your teeth and what sorts of, you know, how you should raise your children, and all those sorts of kind of internal forms of governance as well as the governmental ones. But yeah, I think that it is important to see that in many ways they earned what they got.
Yeah. Well, like another slightly different example is like Cunningham Dax, who was like the psychiatrist who headed up the mental health in Victoria from like the early 1950s to the early 1970s. He's an interesting example of what you were describing, because he's a British psychiatrist. He's brought in, the Premier at the time didn't even sort of interview him. Basically just, you know, the state needed to sort of import the sort of elite professions, so to speak. And he did an awful lot of good and was very much informed by that sort of professional ethos. But that professional ethos also constructed, you know, the sort of the big closed institutions and all that sort of stuff, which started to, I guess, get changed from the early 1970s. And because I worked in the health department during the Royal Commission on Child Abuse, I actually had to go through a lot of the historical documents of the health department to check there was nothing dodgy going on. And we'll find out if there was. And I found this document. So Cunningham Dax left the health department in the early 1970s. And then in, I think, the early to mid 1980s, when sort of new public management, social justice reforms, the sort of non-medical model, etc., all sort of coalescing together around the change in the approach to health and mental health in Victoria. He comes back and writes this paper, which is in the archive. One of your PhD students perhaps can check it out sometime, where he talks about bureaucratic psychiatry and that the mental health has been taken over by the managers, basically by the bureaucrats, and it's been run to all the kind of systems that you've talked about, and it's lost that sense of ethos of care, I guess. And to some degree, the story of the health department in Victoria over the last 20 years or so has been it lost its whole sense of being grounded in health, and it just became a great big budget machine, simplification, and it's sort of starting to regain some of that ethos now. So yeah, it's just that interesting. I mean, inevitably, when a big story like yours is brought down to individuals, you get the sort of intertwining. But I can see the same sort of issues in play. One of the things I just wanted to ask you about too was this sort of big social change in the 1970s, because in a way, it's what you're referring to is a broader backdrop of big social change, and like people today are talking about, you know, the world crisis, the poly crisis, and all this sort of thing. How do you characterize that big social change in the 1970s? Because the other thing that happens then is it's really the beginning of the mass expansion of higher education, that, as well as the professions management dynamic, is also going to fundamentally change the experience of universities.
Yeah, it really. I was really struck as I did this work one of the key primary sources for me was the professional journals, and as I was reading for each of the professions, so my sample was accountancy, engineering, medicine, law, journalism, social work, nursing, and teaching. I feel like there's 9. Maybe there's one I missed. So as I was reading them, I was really struck by how similar not only were to one another in the 1970s, but how, as they shifted from there onwards, they looked so similar to the story I already knew about universities. So all the changes in the ways that of being an academic, of working in a growing managerial class, had applied to everybody else as well. And in some ways this was kind of comforting, and I thought in other ways it made me feel like, gosh, the task ahead is even harder than I thought. But yeah, so of course, the university enrollments are growing in the 60s and 70s because of the baby boom, as well as the shift in the economy that is underway. Now, it's disrupted a little bit by the inflationary period, so that we have much less growth, at least in Australia, in Australian universities in the early part of the 1980s. But then suddenly, people seem to think that Dawkins is the cause of this, and it's a bit hard to see how that's true. But it's about the same time as the system reforms that it grows massively, and it's not just it's the whole world. It was growing very fast since 1945, but nothing like what has happened ever since then. And I think we can attribute much of that to the expansion of the professions. Certainly when I first did the numbers on the growth of the professions in Australia, the professions were growing faster than university enrolments in the late 80s, early 90s. And I was going, how did this work? look at the immigration figures, and so that skilled immigration was the beginning of that process, and the university enrolments began to catch up in order to supply after that. But it is that massive growth of the universities and the growth of both the new public management and kind of a broader sense of managerialism, and it kind of coincides, not coincidentally though, as I would expect, with the kind of culture war that says that kind of those universities are suppressing free speech that says this, and they're promoting these ideas. There's a kind of Gramscian conspiracy of leftists that are trying to transform the world from within the universe. Those things all arise at the same time, so that they kind of crash in on each other within the universities, giving more fuel, I think, to the kind of managerial takeover, really, of these what have become massive institutions, employing really many thousands of people, and responsible for kind of the training of the workforce that employers used to do, in ways that put them in a really important position, but in a really vulnerable one as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. No, I actually worked with a few of the people who were involved in the Dawkins reforms over the years, and broader reforms to education, etc. So it's an interesting thing, and I guess my overall kind of viewpoint on it is that it's a bit of a tragic story, the modern university, because, with all the best intentions, mass expansion of higher education to, increase people's knowledge, so boost the economy, etc. And so many more people have had the wonderful experience of university education, which is undoubtedly positive thing, but I think the perhaps the value and the quality of the experience of that education has diminished over time, and with the mass expansion, and perhaps we haven't quite worked out how to give both the quality experience and the broader participation. And that's perhaps the challenge for the years ahead. What do you think about that?
Yeah, as you can imagine, I've given this a lot of thought since writing a book about universities and working every day. I think getting out of this is going to be very difficult. I think what strikes me, I don't know that I would describe the quality of the education as less, or of the experience. It's really just so radically different to what it was, even from the early 90s when I went to university myself. And I think one of the things that is different and is really observable among young people is how intensely they feel the pressure on themselves to invest kind of relentlessly in their own human capital, and that how do they even know to do this is a question, but they do. They know that they should go to university and get a degree. They know that they should volunteer in certain areas so that they've got experience and networks. They know that wherever they have the opportunity to gain more hands-on experience and increase their networks, they should. They learn to signal their belonging to a professional class by the things that they eat, the ways that they consume, and they learn all of this so that their whole little selves, these beautiful young things that should be enjoying and exploring and considering big new ideas, they kind of live in this terrifying world of massive change, of so much uncertainty, and the only response that they have is this kind of relentless investment in their own human capital. And we in the universities have benefited from this in some respects, we can say. So that in some ways what we've done is extract that value to grow the universities in the way that we have. And perhaps a reversal of that would not be a tragedy. It's hard to say. The way that the universities run, though, where we've got one group of people who are in charge of the allocation of resources and of strategic decision making, and the other group of people who bear the cost of those decisions, is this is absolutely untenable. I think we've really reached the end point of where this was supporting growth in both the universities. And if we think about the ways that this kind of investment in human capital kind of stimulates the economy, is part of what I think has been going on. And I think we've probably, I'm a historian, and predicting the future is a very bad thing for a historian to try to do. But
they're just as bad as everyone else.
I mean, how do we disentangle? I'm a very big fan of Raewyn Connell's book, The Good University, and I think that she's got such a good way of seeing these institutions after long experience, as well as her extraordinary sociological mind. So I agree with her that I think the only really plausible path is something that looks much more democratic. And I don't mean going back to old forms of academic hierarchical collegial governance. I mean something new that is properly democratic, that would include the people doing the professional work, who are now kind of trained professionals themselves, and deserved a lot more respect when they weren't as well than they received. But I think something that means that the people who are doing the work are in a position to contribute in a serious way to the decisions about the allocation of resources and the development of strategy. We look at the kind of bloated managerial salaries, let alone the number of people occupying those things. And government has some blame to bear for this as well, where kind of the growing complexity of relating to departments of education, to the ARC, and other things, means that you kind of need more managers. But none of this is doing the job of teaching the people that we need to teach, of exploring new ideas, of producing kind of the exciting research that we spend way more time filling out forms about this stuff than we do any of the other things, and it's really gotten out of control.
Well, that's a really excellent positive note to end on. That would be a good thing to do. It actually reminds me, there was a huge crisis in some of the health institutions in Britain in, 10-ish years ago, which was partly driven by this excessive kind of performance target managerial sort of approach to the world. And part of the response from people was to cultivate more of a sense of ethos of care, ethos of professionalism, ethos of a different kind of relating within the institutions themselves. And in a way, I think you're sort of articulating a similar idea in the education institutions as well.
And probably across the professions, I think. I think if we look at what's just happened with PricewaterhouseCoopers, for example, we can no longer focus on success as the only thing that matters. I think we need to return to some of the values that we all hold for each of our professions.
Yeah. Well, that very elegantly takes me to my final question to you, Hannah, which is that so one of the themes of my podcast is to sort of focus on how history is not just for historians, but it's actually a resource for people in their everyday life, a way of, mindfully living in the current world and not getting too carried away with the stories we tell each other about the present and the past. And I wonder what, beyond your professional life, how do you see history supporting you live well like that in your own life? hope it's not too personal a question, but you know what I mean.
There's a few different ways, isn't there? One of the things that history tells us is that things do not stay the same, and and that if we like how things are, that can be threatening. But actually, this tells us that we can make changes. We can make the world better, and I think that that's one of the ways that I think history helps me to feel less despair at the polycrisis that we live in than I might otherwise. I guess the other is that there's history is kind of this lovely combination of, and which makes it hard to do, sorry, to be fair, of kind of big patterns where we can see the long running structures that that shape our present, and that really helps us to understand it. But we can also see the ways that those big structures are never solely determinant of the things that happen. And so that the ways that people interacted with them, that resisted them and worked collectively to rethink them often enough, have also been completely important to the way that that the world has changed and grown, and in good ways and bad, and that guides what I think we ought to do as we go forward.
Fabulous. So thank you, Hannah. It's been a wonderful interview. Covered so many things, professions, management, and a few sort of anecdotes from me. Now, your new book, Virtue Capitalist, The Rise and Fall of the Professional Class in the Anglophone World, 1870 to 2008. I just checked on the Cambridge University Press, I think. Yes. Yes. It says it's coming out, online edition on September 2023. So people could perhaps check that out in their university library or local or state library, even perhaps their local library. And of course, if they want to, they can buy the book. But where else can people follow your sort of work? Are you active on the social media?
I am. It's a little hard to encourage Twitter users at the moment, given the state of it. But I am
Ex-users.
Yes, so as I'm also on Blue Sky for those that are slowly trickling into that. And if I also welcome people emailing me if there is anything in particular that they would like to know.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining me on the Burning Archive podcast, Hannah.
Thank you, Jeff. It was terrific to meet you.
Fantastic.